Hello and welcome to today's video about how to set a naming convention to your invoices. In this example, the robot will take these three invoices that were exported from invoice software with name inv- plus index and rename them following the naming convention: invoice number underscore customer name underscore invoice year invoice month. In order to reduce the automation running time, we will take the invoice data from the Excel file invoice reports, as we exported it already during a previous use case. If you haven't had the chance to watch our previous use case about how to extract invoice data using OCR, we recommend you to do so. We strongly believe in simplicity, but real life has complex use cases. That's why the best way to address them is through state machine flows. Let's rename the first sequence, get invoice file data, and open it. First, create a string variable, source path. Then add an assign value activity and add source path as input. Copy the folder path where invoices are currently located and paste it in assign values output parameter between quotes. Don't forget to double the backslash in order to have the robot know it's not a meta character, but a normal character in the string variable. Add a new variable, invoice list, of type array of string. Extend the variable type drop-down list and select the option array T. The page, variable construction, select type, will open and select string, under system. Add a new assign value activity and set the newly created, invoice list, variable as input. In the output parameter use the C# method directory.getFiles, under system.io, that requires two parameters, path and search pattern. The path is the variable, source path. Taking into account in the source path folder there is also an XLSX file and we are interested only in PDF invoices, let's set all.pdf as a search pattern. Create also an int32 variable, number invoices. Add a new assign value activity and set as input the variable, number invoices. In the output we use the count method in order to determine the number of elements, invoices, from the invoice list array. Let's go back to the main page and add a new sequence. Rename it, get Excel data, and also rename the transition from, get invoice file data. Add a message box activity that will inform us what is the invoice to be processed. The text is, invoice to be processed, plus path.getFilename, invoice list, invoice counter. The C# expression path.getFilename returns the file name based on the file path. Invoice list of invoice counter returns a full file path from the array of strings invoice list, based on the position indicated by invoice counter, and int32 variable having default value 0. Secondly, let's add an open Excel workbook activity. Create a new variable invoice W sheet, of type Excel document, and set it in the parameter Excel document of the open Excel workbook activity. The document path parameter must contain the path to invoice report, XLSX. As it's located in the folder as the invoices to be processed, we can use the variable source path. Next add a getCellValue activity and an int32 variable row counter, having default value 1. Now let's create the string variable invoice number. Let's set up the getCellValue activity. The Excel document is invoice W sheet, the row is row counter, column number is 1, and the output is the variable invoice number. Add a new getCellValue activity where Excel document is invoice W sheet, the row is row counter, column number is 2, and the output is the variable customer name. Now let's create the string variable customer name. Add a third getCellValue activity where Excel document is invoice W sheet, the row is row counter, column number is 3, and the output is the variable invoice date. Now let's create the string variable invoice date. As per the agreed naming convention, we need to extract the invoice date month and year. Given the format dd space mmm space yyyy, the easiest way is to use substring. Create two string variables, invoice month and invoice year. Add a new assign value activity and set invoice month as input. In the output we will use substring to extract only the invoice month, SEP, from invoice date. In our case, substring needs two parameters, the start index and the length. Next, add another assign value activity and set invoice year as input. In the output, the start index is 7 and the length is 4. Create a new string variable, new invoice file name, where we will store the new name according to the naming convention. Let's add one more assign value, where new invoice file name is the input and the output is a concatenation of invoice number _ customer name _ invoice year and invoice month plus the .pdf extension. Let's move back to the main page, add a new sequence and rename it rename invoice. Add a move file activity and set invoice list of invoice counter as source file. The destination folder as source path plus the new invoice file name. Practically, we use the move file activity to rename the invoice file name. Let's add a message box activity, and set as output new invoice name, new invoice file name. Let's move back to the main page, add a new sequence and rename it new invoice. Also set the transition from rename invoice to it. Add two assign value activities to increment row counter and invoice counter. And of course, create the int32 variable invoice counter. Let's move back to the main page, add the end sequence, rename it and set the transition from new invoice to the end sequence. Set also a transition from new invoice to get Excel data. As per state machine convention, there cannot be two transitions without condition. This is why it is very important to set a condition to at least one of the two transitions in order to have the robot know what's the next state from next invoice. If invoice counter, after it's incremented by the assign value activity from next invoice, is still smaller than number invoice, then transition 5 is selected and then robot goes again to sequence extract Excel data to rename the next invoice. Otherwise the robot will follow the end sequence and finish the execution. Let's open the end sequence and add a close Excel workbook. Set the variable invoice W sheet in the parameter Excel document and let the value false for the parameter save changes. Finally, let's add a message box activity to inform the automation process to run successfully. Now we are all set, so let's run the workflow. As you can see, it works perfectly and the PDF invoices are being renamed one by one. Before we conclude this use case, let's explore another feature of Tap Studio, the deployment of C# code. Let's go back to the rename invoice sequence, delete the move file activity and add a C# activity. Open Code Editor, press Generate Code Starter and add System.io. Replace Hello World with the file move function, which requires two string parameters, the source file and the destination file. Now let's run again. And it also works as expected. Thank you for watching.